Welcome, everyone. We're very pleased to have you join us this evening, no matter what time zone or part of the world you're attending from. My name is Susan Lauer. I'm the administrator of the Maharishi Vastu Office for North America. In our webinar this evening, Jon Lipman, our Chief Vastu Architect for North America, will discuss how buildings enhance spiritual values by enlivening consciousness. In this talk, Jon will uncover deep strategies that enliven spirituality in the work of the celebrated American architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and show parallels and differences from his work to that of Maharishi Vastu. After the talk, Jon will be joined in a recording by Dr. Eike Hartmann, our International Director for Maharishi Vastu Architect, and they will be answering questions after Dr. Hartmann's comments on Jon's talk. For those of you not familiar with Dr. Hartmann, he was present at every stage of Maharishi's investigation into and restoration of the technology of Vastu, as authenticated by the ancient Vedic science, the Sthapatya Ved, or Vedic architecture. Jon's talk is based on a presentation he gave this summer at the annual conference of the Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality Forum, which was held on the grounds of Frank Lloyd Wright's iconic structure, Fallingwater. Jon's presentation was selected by the organizers of the conference as the best, and we think you will also find it fascinating. Okay, Jon, would you like to begin?
You bet. Spirituality has been at the core of my being since I was very young. A lot of my early work on the famous American architect Frank Lloyd Wright was driven in part by this core. Experiencing the best of his work seemed to nourish my spiritual growth, and it seemed to me that this was not a coincidence, but rather it was his agenda. So on the occasion when I was with his widow, Olga Vanna Lloyd Wright, in their living room at Taliesin West, I used the occasion to ask her, was your husband, Frank Lloyd Wright, a spiritual man? She fixed her eyes on me and responded, every thought he had, every word he spoke was spiritual. Well, this answer gave me a measure of external confirmation in my quest to probe an agenda of spiritual architecture in Wright's domestic work, and later elsewhere also. And it has led to this thesis that there may be two strategies in domestic architecture found across cultures that promote spiritual growth, that develop consciousness. These strategies are applied using differing techniques in different traditions. It took my looking closely at the buildings to conclude that these strategies, these devices are actually the same underlying strategies. So in my talk, I will illustrate these two strategies with examples from two seemingly utterly disparate cultures. First, there was the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, and I think I will share my screen now. First, the work of Wright. The house that we see, the model of a house that we see behind Wright himself, is called Fallingwater. It was designed in 1936 for Herbert Johnson, the owner of the Johnson Wax Company, a year after Wright designed his most celebrated house, Fallingwater. I wrote the first book on the Johnson Wax buildings, and our firm restored the Johnson Wax Administration building's great workroom. And we also wrote a historic report on Wingspread and did restoration work on it. Researching this historic structure, I pieced together how the house came to be designed, which led me to some of the paper's insight. In the keynote address at the conference at which I originally delivered this talk, Anat quoted Frank Lloyd Wright saying, "Nature is all the body of God that we are ever going to see." The first of the two strategies used to promote spiritual growth consists of heightening a personal, intimate, connection between the occupant and some aspect of the natural world that the client finds especially moving. This can induce the client to transcend the phenomenological level of reality and to drive their awareness to the realm that Ralph Waldo Emerson and Wright called nature with a capital N on the top. And this experience leads to spiritual growth. I will explain how later. So I call this strategy nature with a capital N and nature with a small n. I will explain. In the home that Wright designed for Herbert F. Johnson in 1936, Wingspread, the home's name and form are one. Wright designed it as a zoned house. It consists of 4 wings or zones that pinwheel out from a central family shared zone. But there is a more profound meaning to the name Wingspread. Johnson's father bought a large tract of field, forest, and stream to hunt waterfowl. He dammed up a stream to create a reservoir that would attract geese and ducks. And from a knoll that overlooks the reservoir, the birds were an easy shot. His son, Wright's client, hunted on the parcel as his father did. But our client's daughter, Karen Johnson Boyd, told me that gradually her father and she fell so in love with the birds that he ceased hunting them and went so far as to make the property a wildlife sanctuary. She recounted to me how she and her father would instead picnic on this knoll where they used to hunt and gaze in rapture at the dance of nature above and below them. Now, changing subjects slightly, in 1935, the year before, Edgar Kaufman Sr. had taken Wright to see the rock ledge from which he loved to view a waterfall. And Wright made that ledge the hearth in the living room of the Kaufman's weekend home, famously known as Fallingwater. 1 year and 3 months after Wright had begun the design of the Johnson Wax Administration Building, Johnson and his daughter Karen took Wright to this knoll. Well, there's a house on it now, but beneath it there's a knoll, from which they had communed with nature after formerly hunting, communed with nature via the flying waterfowl, and Wright convinced them, as he had done with Edgar Kaufman, to build a home on that spot. This is the origin story of Wingspread, which gives a deeper meaning to its name. In the case of both Fallingwater and Wingspread, which we see in this photo, of course, Wright created a house that would heighten the owner's relationship to a deeply meaningful aspect of nature. And in both cases, Wright named the homes with a title that memorialized this deep meaning. Wingspread is a one-story house, save the master bedroom wing, which we see on the right. Wright elevated this wing to the second floor in spite of having no function to put on the first floor under it. And note that this wing cantilevers out into space, almost like a bird's wing. To what purpose? Well, in this site plan that I drew, the house is in red here, and it was accessed from the road here that hugged Lake Michigan, the blue here. Here is that reservoir, which was formed from this dammed up stream. And here, of course, was the knoll over the reservoir that the house eventually became placed on. So the client wanted a driveway that went straight to the house. That is, from here straight up to the house, as we see in this black line. He even purchased some land in order to permit him to put the driveway there. But Wright talked him out of it. Instead, Wright designed the driveway that follows the red line. See, it crosses the stream, necessitating building a bridge, giving a vista of the house perched above the reservoir, and then the driveway proceeded in tight loops towards the house. That spiraling driveway has since been abandoned, which is, to me, an architectural tragedy. But I once followed the ruts of the abandoned driveway in a four-wheel drive vehicle, and I had an astonishing, even eerie experience. Suddenly, I was motionless, and instead it was the house that was rotating. It spun as the driveway tightened, and my path, precisely as designed by Wright, wrapped me in a tightening spiral around that cantilevered master bedroom, and it became an animated wing of a great creature hovering in the air, an abstraction of the Canada geese in flight that so nourished Johnson, wings spread. To another building, Wright's primary residence, Taliesin in Wisconsin, is located on a ridge that formed the western boundary of his maternal family's land, Wyoming Valley. Its name in his maternal family's language of Welsh is translated as Shining Brow, Taliesin. In the popular 19th century retelling of the Knights of the Round Table story, the mythical English figure of Taliesin was the bard or prophet of the court of King Arthur. The gift of prophecy is associated in many spiritual traditions with an area of the body above the eyebrows. Surely the naming the bard Shining Brow signified his gift of prophecy. And Wright spoke of himself as a prophet. So I contend that it is not out of the question that this esoteric meaning of the name Taliesin was in Wright's mind when he named his home Taliesin. The name is also literally appropriate, as we see better in this photo. The house sits on the brow of the ridge and not on its top, in Wright's words, of the hill, not on the hill. Well, if we go inside, the west wall of the living room is one of the most recognizable and celebrated set pieces in all of Wright's oeuvre. But if one rotates 180 degrees and gazes instead at the eastern half of the living room, one faces continuous strip windows, which we see, which frame a view of the ridge that forms the eastern enclosure of Wright's ancestral valley. The profile of this ridge, where my cursor is going, is recapitulated in the profile of the ceiling of the living room. This discovery by me transformed my experience of this living room into that of a void that is as if occupying the interior of the range of hills, bringing a heightened intimacy to the experience of Wright's beloved family valley. My own experience, and I argue the experience that Wright designed for himself at Taliesin and Johnson at Wingspread and Kaufman at Fallingwater, to have every day was the heightening of a personal, intimate connection to the natural world, which induced transcendence and opening to what Wright and his spiritual mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, both called nature with a capital N. Well, what is this capital N nature? It goes by many names. To Emerson and Wright, it was nature with a capital N or the good with a capital G. In the Vedic literature, it can vary variously depending upon what aspect of it we're talking about, be called Atma or Purusha. Translated, it can be referred to as the absolute or pure consciousness in Maharishi's terms. In the language of quantum physics, we can state that it is the unified field. The unmanifest structure of Atma and the unified field of physics have precisely the same mathematical map and the same 40 qualities. When two things are identical mathematically and in qualities, we call them the same thing. The Vedic tradition attributes to Atma the qualities of being unmanifest, infinite, unbounded, consisting of pure creativity and intelligence, of being coherent, evolutionary, and of possessing an architecture, even though it is unmanifest. We, and even some researchers in neuroscience, consider a universal field of consciousness to be the platform from which our thinking manifests. We think of it as being solely transcendent, inaccessible to most of us, save in momentary, ineffable flashes that inspire religious and spiritual traditions, but it is the birthright of the human nervous system to maintain pure consciousness, Atma, permanently, even in the midst of dynamic activity. And this is a key stage in the growth of enlightenment and the unfoldment of our full potential as humans. This is real spirituality to me. And so while this would be the subject of another talk entirely, I can say with some confidence that the growth of enlightenment orients us to social responsibility, dissolving such phenomena as racism and crushing wealth disparity, because as enlightenment becomes a reality, for us, we come to experience the unity in all things. And when we do, every person, creature, and our planet are ourselves, and we love them as we love ourselves. This is the experience as consciousness expands. I want to argue, as I think Wright did, and certainly the Vedic tradition does, that the highest aspiration of architecture is to promote in its users this growth. Well, let us turn now to the second of the two strategies. A widespread technique for spiritual development, for the growth towards enlightenment, is to set up opportunities for the mind to spontaneously expand from a focused point. In my case, using transcendental meditation, a mantra, a sound. In other traditions, it may be a statue, a symbolic graphic, etc., in such a way that eventually the awareness expands in the direction of the unbounded or Atma. The regular alternation between focused mind and expanded mind cultivates in the mind the ability to maintain transcendence or infinity or Atma, or the good, in the midst of dynamic activity. And so, my second thesis is that Wright set up opportunities in his buildings to allow the mind to cycle back and forth between some point and expanded perception. We can call it infinity. So let's find this in wing spread. It's pretty easy. The building's core is a singular, visually arresting fireplace and chimney, but the great room is wrapped on four sides by very tall piers. Here are some piers, and out here. They are encircled in the floor plan here by the red rectangles, sets of piers. They frame tight views that force your eye out into the distant sky. So when you're in this room, your awareness shuffles back and forth between the fire and the fireplace here, a kind of a point, to out the window, something approaching infinity. Point, infinity. The next example from Wright's work, the Thomas Hardy House, also in Racine, Wisconsin, designed by Wright much earlier, 1905, is well known to architects from its striking rendering on the left, inspired by the Japanese ukiyo-e block prints beloved by Wright, and exquisitely delineated by Wright's gifted associate, Marion Mahoney Griffin. The house perches on and is embedded in a high bluff overlooking Lake Michigan. The upper level portion of the lot was so narrow that the lot was considered unbuildable, and Wright told Hardy to buy the lot anyway, because Wright envisioned how it could be used for a house that cascades down the bluff, arrested at its bottom by a massive plinth, which we see on the right here. Now, cliff swallows nest in the safety of the almost cliff-like faces of the bluffs that ring much of the lower end of Lake Michigan, including this site. I grew up playing in sand dunes on the edge of Lake Michigan, and I was gripped watching the tiny cliff swallows who burrow their nests deep into the cliffs disappear into darkness in the sheer faces of the sand dunes. Surely Wright, a keen observer of nature, spotted them on the site of the future Hardy House. Might he have conceived of the house as an analog to the avian shelters that his new home would supplant? Well, it's a stretch that I don't want to pull too far, but it is stimulating to contemplate. So perhaps it is an illustration of nature, but that's not why I'm showing this house. Rather, the core of the Hardy House is a two-story space. Well, we can see it here. This is the two-story space from the outside, the living room, whose east face is completely glass, as we see. Glass even continues to wrap for one more bay to the north and to the south, as we can see here, of this magnificent proto-curtain wall. It presents, and here we are inside, an unbroken panorama of Lake Michigan below, stretching to the horizon as we see on the right, where the lake merges with the endless, unbroken sky above. As we see on the right, the vista of the lake and sky is breathtaking. When the house was built, there were no trees in the foreground to stop one's eye from going out to infinity. But notice what's on the left, a recessed masonry wall with an inset fireplace. The occupant of the house, sitting perhaps right here in a chair, will gaze at the dancing flame and then out the panorama into infinity and back again and back and forth, awareness swinging from point to infinity. Well, we turn now to a system of architecture that places the development of spirituality, or what I choose to call growth to enlightenment, as its central objective, and I have been practicing it for 26 years. One of the limbs of the Vedic literature is Sthapatya Ved, the knowledge of establishing structures, the Vedic science of the architecture of nature. When this is applied to the architecture of humanity, we call it Vastu, which can be translated as a structure according to natural law. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the celebrated Vedic teacher, best known for introducing the Transcendental Meditation Technique, or TM, to the West, organized a 20-year research project to restore Vastu to its ancient integrity so that its practice would reliably bring influences of good physical and mental health, family harmony, success, and growth to enlightenment. While the published medical research on the subject makes a convincing case that he succeeded, in April of 2022, I published as the lead author a literature review on the subject in the journal Global Advances in Health and Medicine that demonstrate the true effectiveness of this technology to have these beneficial effects upon its users. But that would be the subject of another lecture. To identify the practice of Vastu as Maharishi restored it, this practice of Vastu is referred to as Maharishi Vastu, or sometimes by the acronym MVA. So how does Maharishi Vastu use the strategies of point infinity and nature? Well, in very different ways than Wright used. On Thursday afternoon at the conference where I first gave this talk, the speaker Clive Knight asked all of us, "Where am I? What is the aspect of nature? What is the natural environment that we inhabit?" He and I agree on the answer. The core answer to that question is, I am on planet Earth. This is the essential reality of Maharishi Vastu architecture. The Earth's primal architectural characteristic is that it is a sphere which rotates about an axis which emerges from the Earth at the North and South poles. And because of the rotation of the poles, the sun passes overhead from east to west, and the sun is the most powerful aspect of natural law on Earth, and everything on Earth is as it is because of the sun and its energy. And we can render visible the prime passages of its key energy across the surface of the Earth by tracing lines east-west to display the passage of the sun overhead, and lines north-south connecting the poles. What we have look like the lines of latitude and longitude. These are not solely an abstract expression of natural law on the surface of the Earth. They are also a physical reality. The subset of physics known as spherical harmonics has concluded that all rotating celestial spheres, such as our planet, generate quantum mechanical standing waves, which form a grid running, in the case of planet Earth, due north-south and east-west, as we see in this illustration. For a building to integrate into nature, a powerful strategy is therefore to align it with this grid. This means that the walls and spaces of a building are aligned with the cardinal directions, and this dark black square represents the walls of a simple house within the grid of north, south, east, west on planet Earth. This is a key tenet of Maharishi Vastu. All buildings, all rooms, all walls align with the Earth's grid. This is one of the strategies in Maharishi Vastu that align us with cosmic reality, with nature. It sounds abstract, but the effect is real. Now, how does Maharishi Vastu use the strategy of point infinity? Well, let's first look at how the strategy is used in the architecture of the structures of nature. When we think of galaxies, solar systems, various structures of nature, galaxies, solar systems, stars, planets, human physiology, cells, the molecules in our cells, including DNA, and atoms, and some selected examples of them are on the screen. At every scale, they have a core, and the activity of the structure occurs around the core. From the Vedic perspective, this is not a coincidence. At the core of a core is a central point. A point has no length, no breadth, no height. In other words, it has no physical materiality. From our perspective, a point is the junction between unmanifest reality and any physical natural structure. So remember that one of my synonyms for unmanifest reality is consciousness. It is simply the nature of consciousness to become conscious, to become aware. But it cannot become aware in the abstract. It becomes aware by having a thought that is collapsing consciousness into a point. The thought is the point value of unmanifest consciousness. And thus, I would argue, we think. The mind is an apparatus that supports consciousness collapsing into a point. The same mechanism underlies the physical structures of nature. At their core is always a point, which, as I just mentioned, is unmanifest, and this maintains the structure of nature in balance and harmony with the unmanifest and all of the manifest structures of nature. This is the significance of point infinity. It is the structure by which nature stitches each of its structures into wholeness. And how is this used in Maharishi Vastu buildings? The very center of the Maharishi Vastu building is a point. We see the little red square. A square core around it, called a Brahmastan in Sanskrit, is marked on the floor of a Maharishi Vastu home. Extending out from it are unbroken vistas to the east, to the west, to the north, to the south, and ideally also upward as an axis mundi. Priority is given to the eastern axis to connect the structure's occupants to the rising sun and thus to natural law. So ideally, a Maharishi Vastu home faces east. The way in which the unfolding from the point, from the Brahmastan into the full house is executed is through a diagram that we see on the left, which locates each of the different qualities of natural law as it moves from point value out into more abstract values. And those differing values, which are aligned with the differing qualities of the sun as it appears to rotate around the earth, allow us to locate different functions, different rooms within a house, as we see lower right, in locations where a particular quality will support them. Now, this sounds abstract, but the effect upon the occupants of Maharishi Vastu buildings is profound. And I speak both from personal experience and from a review of the medical literature. I'll illustrate this with a few photographs of my own home. In it, why my home? Well, I know it and it's available to me, but also because I used both Wright's application of the two strategies as well as the Vedic application, so we can see them both. It's kind of a twofer. At the center of this photograph, we see a square on the floor dimly in this photo. This is the Brahmastan, and it permits the point to be in our awareness at the core. And notice the unbroken vista to the west and above. In this photo, the vista to the south is seen. And in our bedroom, my love of Wright's vocabulary, I think, is clear. And I use the interior surfaces of the house's walls as an experimental palette of materials in nature that give me joy. To tint the wet plaster, I used varying percentages of dirt from our yard. In this panel, we see leaves of cattails here, over here on the far right, from our pond that I pressed into the wet plaster. And I love birch bark, and so I used it very selectively as a wall covering. Nature and the house blur. The effect on me is one of continuous inspiration and spiritual growth. Nature, point infinity. Two strategies found in homes, in cultures that can integrate the relative and the absolute in our daily experience and thus promote the expansion of consciousness. Thank you.
So thank you, dear Jon. This was very inspiring and insightful presentation. We had been working together for so many years, even decades, but only now we fully understand the life-transforming stages of your evolution and growth and how you had become the main exponent of Maharishi Vastu architecture in the United States of America. Working under the spell and influence of the greatest American architect of his time, and even serving as the president of the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, it is obvious that there was always the attraction to cultivate a deep connection to nature, nature with a big N, and the natural law of the land, and bringing it into the structure of the house, and at the same time creating a sense of order and harmony in the environment. Now, the result you have demonstrated in your own home, which we enjoyed so much to see, and which is standing today as a great example and witness of the spirit of contemporary prairie architecture in the image of the master. As you explained, this type of architecture is always spiritual and has been practiced throughout time in different cultures and ancient civilizations. Whenever the architect manages to connect to a more expanded level of living in greater harmony, peace, and unboundedness, the consciousness of the observer becomes elevated and inspired. You called it consciousness-based architecture, which is able to connect individual life with cosmic life, and to connect individual intelligence with cosmic intelligence, and provides a glimpse of the awesome experience of unified existence. You have explained that consciousness also has a structure. It is the structure of total wholeness, containing all opposite values at the same time. It may have been described in different ways in philosophy, mathematics, and quantum physics, but as architects, we prefer the most clear and visual statement of, as you say, point and infinity, which is actually the definition of universe. The point is maximum unified, and infinity expanding is maximum diversified. Unity and diversity at the same time in one word is universe. Now, how does this abstract structure translate into physical architecture? You were explaining it in one way, I'll do it in some other way. Because wherever one is living, somewhere one is established in the infinity of time and space. That is the point where you're living, the point value. This individual point is obviously located on the surface of this planet Earth. We are living here, and this location is very precise. It is defined by what we call coordinates. You may have a postal address, but that's not so accurate. So the coordinates are, as you had explained, these are the longitudes and latitudes. These are the lines that connect the North and South Pole and are parallel to the equator. Now the point is defined by the intersection of these two lines from north to south and east to west, always at right angles. In Vedic architecture, these lines coincide with the center lines of the Vastu building, and the point where the lines intersect constitute the center point or Brahmastan of the building plan, and from there it becomes the source of alignment, symmetry, order, placement, and proportion. Now this line that goes from west to east is with reference to the sun. Wherever one is on the earth, the sun is always rising in the east. The energy of the day is also rising in the east and setting, going down, it is in the west. So the sun on its apparent path from east to west generates different energies, and these energies, they generate a special polarity. It is total plus when rising on one side and minus when it is sinking, when the energy is going down, goodbye. So from this we derive that the directions have specific qualities which we always take into account when building a Vastu home and laying out the rooms and functions, etc. You had shown these diagrams. Now it is the science and art of Vedic architecture of building in harmony with natural law, and we have built hundreds of such homes, schools and colleges and office buildings around the world, and especially in the United States, all planned, designed, and supervised by yourself. And as we heard today, you completed a huge evolutionary cycle of learning and accomplishment in the field of architecture and personal development. We are so impressed, and thank you for this great presentation and eye-opening webinar. I hope it gets recorded and edited properly to inspire the next generation of architects and their students. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate. Thank you.
We have then next questions and answers. Dr. Hartmann, and in a couple of cases I, answered questions at our webinar on Thursday afternoon when he was connecting live. And so we're going to replay those Q&As now. And then when that's done, we'll be able to take some more questions. Susan will, live today.
How can one reconcile the installation of a Faraday cage within the structure if you are needing to reduce the electromagnetic radiation within a Vastu house, and also with the general instruction in a Maharishi Vastu house not to have metal in the structure? John, maybe you'd like to answer that?
The actual instruction is a little different than this questioner described. The instruction is to minimize iron or ferrous metals, including steel. It is technically possible to make a Faraday cage with non-ferrous metal wires, that is aluminum or even copper. So that would be a solution. And it may be that it is widely done with aluminum wires. I'm not an authority on that. So we have, on the one hand, the eternal knowledge of Vastu derived from Stapachaved. And we have, on the other hand, the fact that we are living in the 21st century in which we have certain unique to this time humanly created environmental toxins. And if they are acute enough that we need to address them, and there's one particular solution to one current human environmental toxin that doesn't immediately resolve with Maharishi Vastu, then we have to think with the experts, with the engineers in the field, and see what the best marriage will be of the eternal perspective on health and any specific health requirement that is true just right now in history.
Ike, maybe you would like to comment or on a question. Did Maharishi ever have conversations with non-Vastu architects about architecture?
Well, obviously, he liked to talk to all kinds of inventors and geniuses like Buckminster Fuller. And in the early days, he had many architects working with him and designing. But when it happened that he learned about Stapatya Veda and the principles that are described in the Veda, then it took some time for him to work it out. And he worked it out by talking to all the relevant and famous Stapadis of India who had different angles. You know, they were temple builders and they were from North India and South India, etc. So he had, for 10 years or more, he had a whole consortium of different experts around him, a board of Stapadis, and he posed all kinds of jobs and questions to them to sort out the knowledge. So that was a great work we did from the Vedic literature and from the living experts and exponents of that. And the result is what John was calling, it is called Maharishi Vastu architecture. That's what we are practicing, and that's what we had learned from Maharishi as he purified the knowledge that had been, it got corrupted over time, as any knowledge does, through the long corridor of time. It gets kind of confused and translated in different languages and different traditions and different family traditions. And also there was a long time of foreign occupation in India. The Muslims had taken hold of all the temple builders, of all the Stapadis. And the British came, so the knowledge got lost, and thank God now it has been restored and made available in such a way that it can be practiced anywhere on the globe. It has become universal knowledge. So now John is back and we can have another question.
I think actually this brings up a really good point. We make an emphasis on the fact that what Maharishi did with Vastu, and he certainly did it also with Ayurveda, is he restored it. And that is a very different, in the English language anyway, it's a very different definition and principle than a revival. And what you just described gives us a very clear understanding of the fact that this is a restoration of knowledge that had been quite a bit lost, actually. Okay, John, maybe you'd like to comment on if the strategy that you so wonderfully outlined to us and defined for us of nature may manifest in different ways in other cultures. And certainly there are many examples that we can all think of, but maybe you can give us some examples of those from other cultures where this same principle is lively?
Yes, I haven't focused on it as much, but there are probably an almost infinite number of examples, and one that comes to mind is the ancient construction in the mountains in Peru, which have very specific, the buildings are arranged with very specific references to the profile of the mountain range behind them and the rising of stars in clefts between mountains, such that when you're in the common spaces surrounded by the buildings, you're drawn into a web that includes not only the space and the buildings, but also nature on Earth behind you and the cosmos behind that. Very moving. There are many, many examples. Another one is Gothic cathedrals, which up until the Second Vatican in around 1960 or 63, Mass was always done with the priest, as I understand, facing east, and the congregation behind them, the priest also facing east, and there would be a special rose window in the east wall of the building, which represents the sun, even though they may not be performing Mass at sunrise, still the representation of the sun is right in front of them. And so when they're going through this consecrating religious ceremony, they are also, through their orientation and through the architecture and the ornamentation, being woven into a greater kind of cosmic unity. And so I think that is certainly also an example of nature.
Thank you, Jon. This question just came in from someone. According to the Vastu Shastra, there is something in this world that cannot be measured, perhaps a sacred place, some temple, something that is beyond our senses. Eike, would you like to answer that?
If you want to measure, there are two things you want to measure. That which is smaller than the smallest, that what is bigger and the biggest, and in between all other measurements are then known. So that what is smaller than the smallest and bigger than the biggest, there is a Sanskrit term which goes Anuraniyan, Mahato Mahiyan. Anu is the atom. That what is smaller than the smallest atom, it is transcendental, and that what is bigger than the most expanded value of the whole entire universe, that is also beyond the infinity. And then what it is, that is the pure consciousness. That is the point of Atma. Jon was explaining it. So it is, you can't say, is it smaller than the small? Is it small or is it big? You can't say what consciousness is. It is everything at the same time. So therefore it cannot be measured.
Thank you very much. That is the perfect answer. Also, another gentleman asks, Dr. Hartmann, can you remind me where in the Veda it says, quote, no one reaches enlightenment without understanding the process of creation?
I wouldn't know exactly where it is, but it sounds as if it's somewhere in the Upanishads.
Okay, thank you. Well, that gives him a starting basis for sure. All right, Jon, there was one other question that we thought might be good for you to answer. Do you think that Frank Lloyd Wright knew about Vastu?
I don't have any intimation that he did. I've read a great deal that he's written, and he made no references to it.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Because otherwise he would have mentioned the value of orientation. And what he mentioned is the connection to nature. But the nature he referred to is more or less the nature you would see when you look out of the window. The ridge or the lake and, the birds flying and this type of thing. That is the local nature. He never referred to anything that is beyond the local nature. Whereas everyone in nature knows, you can ask them, the elephants and the tigers and the lions and crocodiles and the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees, you can ask them, what is the most important direction? Everybody knows in one voice, they would say, the direction of the rising sun. So the whole earth is bowing down and turning towards the sun. So architecture must recognize this as the most important thing, and only Vedic architecture does that, actually. There's no other architecture. And it's amazing that they don't know it. They don't make any reference to it, except for the temple buildings.
Susan, we will turn it back over to you. Those are all of the answers from Thursday's webinar.
We do have some questions that have come in, and I wanted to say the first one that came in actually refers to the chart that you showed, John, in demonstrating the relationship between the point of the Brahmastan and the general layout of the house. This person says, I have 2 children and therefore I will need 4 bedrooms at least. How will all these rooms be able to fit into the 9 squares of a 1-story house?
The 9 squares are a kind of abstract structure. We actually have an enormous amount of liberty and variation that is available to us. And it's certainly no problem to get 4 bedrooms into a Maharishi Vastu house, not to mention that we might have 2 stories.
Good. Okay, here's a question that I think must come from someone who is probably an architect. Is there a summary of Maharishi Vastu Sthapatya information that Maharishi published that can be purchased by architects?
I think the best summary that can be purchased is the book Building for the Health and Happiness of Everyone, which is available online from Amazon.com. This was put together by Dr. Hartmann and others collaboratively in more recent years. But to read Maharishi's words themselves in a very compressed, condensed, and powerful version, we want to read the book Building for the Health and Happiness of Everyone. This is really the direct answer to your question. And that book, it's a very small book, is available from MIU Press, from Maharishi International University. And its entire contents are posted online on our website, maharishivastu.org. If you go to About Vastu, and then you click on Read a Text About Vastu, then you can work your way page by page through all the pages of this text. There is more that Maharishi said that have been collected in some volumes, but not solely on Maharishi Vastu.
The same person who asked us about getting more bedrooms into that general layout is asking actually if the picture that you showed on the left that contained many small squares and divisions within each of the 9 squares, is it possible that you could explain the significance of those?
Well, around, yeah, that's a kind of a whole lecture itself, and that's a little more advanced and not directly useful for those who want to build Vastu, because the deep and full understanding of this diagram is possessed after a great deal of study by a fully trained and accredited Maharishi Vastu architect. But I can say very briefly that there are 3 concentric square rings. The centermost one is wholeness, undifferentiated. And then the next ring has the 4 cardinal directions and the 4 diagonals. So there are 8 squares all the way around. And then around the outside, there are, I think, 28. When it is fully expressed, when the grid is as large as 7 by 7 or 8 by 8 or 9 by 9 or 10 by 10. And it is in those outer little squares that we call padas that we find the specific qualities that are particular value to us. For instance, just to give you a quick example, one of the padas in the southeast is associated with Agni, which is the transformative quality in nature. And that is what happens when food is cooked. And so it's an ideal place to cook food, so that process is supported by the full value of natural law.
Thank you, Jon. That's more insight than I even had ever heard. The final question that we have, can you please tell us or elaborate on the difference between Vastu and Stapachyaved and what those terms actually refer to?
Stapachyaved, well, Ved, of course, is knowledge, but Maharishi's preferred translation of the Sanskrit term is total or complete knowledge. And Stapatya has at its core the Sanskrit word stapan, which means to establish. And so Stapachyaved is the complete knowledge of how nature establishes structures, or we can simply say the architecture of nature. Vastu, depending on how it is spelt and translated, has multiple meanings, but the pertinent one that we use is that it is a structure according to natural law. So it is the application of the knowledge, the abstract knowledge in Stapachyaved produces a Vastu. And so we say that Stapachyaved is the theory and Vastu is the technology that is applied from the theory.
Right, and that's exactly how Maharishi described it actually in one of his talks. Okay, I think that's it for tonight. If more questions come to mind, you can always email us through the Contact Us form on our website, or simply by sending a message to info@maharishivastu.org.